Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are around the world. This is Dr. Nelson Ogunshakin speaking on behalf of FIDIC as the CEO. You are welcome to the FIDIC COVID-19 webinar series. This is the third in the series of 20 items to cover over the next 2 months. We're delighted you are able to join us. Last week, I think we started the first and the second. I think if my record shows, we had over 600 people that participated on the day one. On Thursday, we had close to 800 people that participated on the program. And today we are focusing on issues to do with joint venture and how do you deal with joint venture relationship during this particular difficult time for the world. Before I start, I would like to pay respect for those who lost their life all over the world, wherever you are, people from North America, from Europe, from Africa, from Asia, in dealing with this difficult and challenging time for all of us. As FIDIC, we represent over 102 countries around the world. Our outlook is global. Our intention is global. Our role is to promote the best in the consulting industry. Today, we are focusing on the issue about joint venture. How do you deal with joint venture in the process? I do have a very, very interesting compilation of people who are going to speak today from legal perspective, from the CEO of a major consulting firm, and more important, before I open the floor to the candidate who are going to speak, is my intention to introduce, the program for the day. I am going to do this introduction, which is really going to be about 5 minutes maximum. I will then invite the president of FIDIC to do a warm welcome, and followed by the vice president of FIDIC, Anthony Barry from Australia, who will also say a few words. Thereafter, I've got 4 eminent speakers from around the world and giving different perspectives, and they will share maximum 5 to 10 minutes on the topic that we are trying to cover. Thereafter, there will be opportunity for the floor, for question to floor. I will start by picking up the question from the floor, and I'll put it to the panel. And after the panel session, Q&A session, I will wrap up in about 5-6 minutes, and we will aim to finish about 1:30 today. Right now, I believe we have 350 people who are connected. We've got 800 who are registered. Without further ado, I'm going to invite the FIDIC president, Bill Howard from CDM Smith, to open the floor. Bill, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Nelson, and I'll be very brief. First of all, I'd like to thank you and the Secretariat for putting these programs together in a very, very short time under a lot of very challenging circumstances with working from home and working remotely. You're doing an outstanding job at presenting some very important material, so thank you very much. I'd also like to thank the speakers who have volunteered their time from their incredibly busy schedules to share with us their thoughts on this important, very important topic. And certainly I want to thank the participants in the webinar, which are approaching about 400 folks, and maybe we'll have a few more as a few minutes pass. The subject today, this is the third webinar, and the subject today is joint ventures, and which I always connect, I think most of us do, with formal teaming arrangements. Many of our projects are somewhat complex and involve joint ventures or something very similar to them, and they present challenges all of the time. They certainly present specific challenges or unique challenges in this time of the worldwide pandemic. So I am looking forward to hearing the presentations on, once again, another very important subject, and want to thank you, Nelson, and your staff for putting these programs together. It's really a spectacular job you folks are doing, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. On this note, I'm going to invite Anthony Barry from Australia to give us a few words of encouragement and give the conversation a kickstart. Tony, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nelson. Firstly, I'd like to hope and pray that you're all safe and well, and that you and your families stay that way. Something we have to work at these days. As you know, there are many reasons to form a joint venture, and the term is often used, as Bill's already alluded to many different types of business relationships. Here I want to talk about both incorporated and unincorporated joint ventures. And the first feature that comes to my mind is characterise a joint venture is they're defined by an achievement or completion of a contract or with an end date. The second important feature is they're usually undertaken by parties for which the joint venture represents only a small part of their operating businesses. This has important implications in the sense that the interests of the joint venture may not always fully align with the interests of the joint venturers themselves, and they might vary throughout the term of the joint venture. So the joint venture mechanism, we all understand, involves sharing reward and risk, resources, costs, intellectual property and liability. And we enter into them for many different reasons, and some of those might include improving our chances of success at winning or completing a project, bringing complementary knowledge and skills together, pooling intellectual property, technology or systems, building capacity or providing flexibility in resourcing, or improving integration and collaboration. There's lots and lots of reasons why we joint venture. The risks in joint venturing are important as well, and it's quite vital in this environment that we understand them. The main ones in my experience are around vague objectives, large imbalances in contribution, clashes in the cultures between the joint venture partners or within the joint venture itself, clashes of leadership style, constrained resources, difficulties with local knowledge and licensing, and unfortunately on occasions bribery, corruption and money laundering. So what does all this mean for joint ventures in the COVID-19 environment? I'm going to address this by starting with joint ventures that are already underway. In the COVID-19 environment, many businesses are experiencing major challenge from leadership, staff health, social distancing regulations, project delays, revenue reductions, interrupted cash flows, technology and systems being challenged, and working from home. Many of these issues speak directly to business viability and sustainability. As I just mentioned earlier, the interests of the joint venture partners may not fully align with the interests of all of them the joint venture may not fully align with the interests of the joint venturers at all times. And that is now the case in the COVID-19 environment. So it's very important as a joint venturer to stay close to and work closely with your joint venture partners to stay abreast of any changes or divergence of interests that might occur. And it's important that we do so to achieve not only the success of the joint venture, but hopefully managing the relationship very successfully. These issues do become vitally important to you and may become vitally important to your joint venture partner at some stage during the COVID-19 situation and beyond. And at the end of the day, a joint venture is only as strong as the joint venture partner's ability to sustain their contribution and to deliver on the commitments in the client-consultant contract. Where a joint venture is incorporated, many of the risks and challenges may on one view be isolated in the incorporated entity. At the same time though, clients will expect and may legally require through collateral deeds, guarantees or similar instruments that the joint venture partners guarantee the performance of that incorporated entity. In any event, even if the partners are challenged and at risk, the incorporated entity would be able to address many of the issues presented by the COVID-19 situation without significant reliance on the joint venture shareholders. The obvious exceptions to this are capital contributions and loan guarantees, which certainly for contractors might be a major issue. In joint ventures operating in a COVID-19 environment, important questions need to be addressed about how the now and the foreseeable future are going to play out. And so questions like, can my business meet the commitments required of it under the joint venture agreement? Can my joint venture partner meet the commitments required of it under the joint venture agreement? And in fact, can the joint venture meet its own commitments to the client? If in answering these questions, if the answer is yes, that's a great thing. If the answer is no, then we must ask what needs to change. And these questions must address issues such as capital contribution, guarantees, cash flow, task completion, personnel and resources, technology and systems, budgets, programs, quality and risk management, and including PI insurance. So these questions in one sense require the parties to enter into an open due diligence discussion about the COVID-19 environment. What does it mean for the joint venture? What does it mean for each of the parties? And I believe that discussion should be led by the board or the steering committee of the joint venture. When businesses are under financial stress, it's particularly important, I think, to recognise that openness does suffer as people focus on survival. They don't really want to tell people the real situation because that may leak to the market, their clients, and there may be, in fact, a degree of panic set in about their circumstance. So it's very important that such discussions are undertaken with a great deal of situational awareness and respect, whilst at the same time focusing on finding out the true situation. Where the joint venture partner is under challenge, either because the partners may not be able to meet their commitments, or it is important to explore options for solutions which focus on those which are good for the client, good for the joint venture, and lastly, good for the individual joint venture partners. The sorts of questions that I think may be worth exploring at the top level are the provisions in the client-consultant contract which may help. Some contracts do have provisions which will facilitate help. Would the client be prepared to vary the terms of the client-consultant contract to provide relief for the joint venture on certain issues? Will the client entertain any relief outside the contract? And areas of obvious focus might include extensions of time and program variations, moving from a milestone or stage payment approach to an agreed cash flow paid on account, changes of personnel. There are many issues where assistance may be easily made available. In a joint venture between two parties, A and B, say, where party B is unable to meet its obligations, there may be also many options which could be explored. And these might include rebalancing the resource inputs between the joint venturers, adjusting the contributions, replacing the joint venture, for example, with a sub-consultancy agreement where party A continues to lead and takes responsibility for the client consultant contract and party B acts as a sub-consultant. Party B could also enter into an arrangement to assign its rights and obligations to party A, dissolving effectively the joint venture. Or it could formally bow out of the joint venture and arrange for party A to become the prime consultant. The other option, which has also been practiced, I've only seen it once in my career, is that a third party came in and took over the role of party B. So there are lots of options, and they do need to be talked about when you get into difficult circumstances, because there's nothing like the client having to terminate the primary contract. None of us want that. The industry doesn't want that. It's not good for us. So what do we think about new joint ventures in the current COVID-19 environment? The fundamental reasons why joint ventures are formed has not changed and may have become even more critical in some circumstances. However, the COVID-19 situation is clearly new to most of us, nearly all of us, and a new environment in which to form a joint venture. So how is that situation different? And there are many answers to that question, some or all of which may apply to a potential joint venture or the jurisdictions in which you're working. And they might include the client's financial security, the availability of capital, the availability of loans, project risks, staff health and safety, office access restrictions, travel restrictions, quarantine arrangements, security of remote working platforms is becoming an issue, security of networks, online meetings and screen sharing, and of course the efficiency and effectiveness of remote working. In looking at potential joint ventures, and in particular assessing a joint venture partner, it's very important in this environment that you exercise serious due diligence on how you're going to go about collaborating, how you're going to resource, how you're going to capitalise the joint venture and support it financially, to make sure that the parties are aligned and the various risk scenarios are talked about, discussed, and approaches developed to the gnarly and difficult problems that could arise during this COVID-19 situation. To me, leadership from the joint venture committee, steering committee, or the board is absolutely vital to make sure that joint venturing is a really good way to work through the COVID-19 environment. So thank you, Nelson, and I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Tony, for that broad overview of the issue about JV. I think I like the way you pitch it. We look at both, project JV and incorporated JV, both in terms of existing JV and also a new JV. Thank you very much for that insight. I think that actually is giving us a very good insight to a natural way to move forward in terms of the topic. I think what we've asked all the speakers to cover is overview of JV transaction, structure and operation. We've looked at the issue about COVID-19 impact on transaction, delivery of service and supply management, impact on decision-making and capital contribution, and then best way of managing challenges and mitigating risk. So it's a very broad issue. And as Tony started, which has given us a very good insight to both corporate and sort of unincorporated JV, and looking at existing JV and potential new JV. At this point in time, I'm going to invite Rob Morson from Pinsent, a partner, to give us 5, maximum to 6-7 minutes on the subject and take it from that point. Rob, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nelson. Thank you, William and Anthony. May surprise you actually that the legal view is very aligned to Anthony's view that he's just expressed. Joint ventures and FIDIC are obviously topics close to my heart. As a Pinsent Masons partner, I'm one of over 400 infrastructure specialists focused on delivering both legal and strategic advice on major global infrastructure projects. And I also recently contributed to Pinsent Masons Joint Ventures Delivering Global Mega Infrastructure Projects Guide, which we published coincidentally in February of this year. I'll be borrowing from that guide during this hour and a bit that we have together, and I'll also make it available in a link afterwards. I'd like us to start by considering the reasons why JV participants, whether they are contractors, consultants, or employers, enter into joint ventures in the first place. In our experience, there are 2 broad categories of infrastructure participants. They either joint venture to procure or deliver infrastructure. In other words, they either play a developmental or execution role. And there are 7 primary drivers that drive the process. These would be regulatory requirements, the ability to pool resources and or capabilities, optimizing the supply chain, boosting balance sheet strength, obviously sharing risk, enhancing competitiveness, and or improving geographical or local knowledge. And that links back to the initial one around regulatory requirements, i.e. having to comply with local requirements. We, of course, hardly ever see joint ventures based on a single driver. Rather, the relationship is driven by multiple drivers, not necessarily in balance. Today, we are dealing with the execution role, specifically for consultants and contractors, but we mustn't forget that employers also joint venture, and those employer joint ventures will also be impacted by the unprecedented circumstances we are facing. If we view matters relatively cynically, which we have to also do, we must recognize that joint venture parties are sometimes motivated more by the desire to secure a contract than the object of delivering it. Far too often, we see joint ventures formed in haste with little or inappropriate consideration for the delivery objective and how the outcome will be achieved. Irrespective of whether or not that is the case from the beginning, the ultimate issue is that the joint venture needs to work and it needs to deliver on its third-party obligations. When projects face foreseeable risks, joint venture members are generally well prepared and equipped to deal with these. Unforeseeable risks, of course, present a greater problem, but unprecedented and particularly complex risks that will present a real challenge are those such as COVID-19. And they'll do that even to the best structured joint ventures and the most experienced participants. The underlying causes may relate to third-party supply chains or internal resource or delivery constraints, and more often than not, a combination of these. I'm of the view that joint ventures are at risk of experiencing the effects of COVID-19 exponentially. Now, what do I mean by that? With each party having a role which it may not be able to fulfill, particularly if that party has a specialist role, each other party that has an independent obligation or a shared liability is likely to be impacted by the consequence vis-a-vis the employer, vis-a-vis the supply chain, and internally. So basically from all sides. Likewise, however, if joint venture members collaborate and what Anthony was talking about, engage transparently and apply themselves, they have the opportunity to mitigate these risks. For example, by pooling resources and know-how that wouldn't otherwise be available to them. Whether they can is a function of what's available. You simply cannot achieve the unachievable. Whether they seek to do so, however, is a function of their attitude and relationship. Meaningful engagement when faced with unprecedented circumstances will entail understanding the impact to each member, not just yourselves, as deeply and effectively as if it was your own. Revisiting the very reasons why the joint venture was structured in the first place and appreciating the extent to which they have been impacted, and reassessing the extent to which the changed circumstances might require even the JV structure to be reconsidered and perhaps rebalanced. I'm not by any means suggesting that COVID-19 presents an opportunity to renegotiate an advantage. Quite the opposite, actually. In fact, I should stress that I'm a strong proponent of not using COVID-19 circumstances to obtain any disproportionate or unwarranted gain. Instead, I'm suggesting that an optimum outcome and the response, including mitigation members, may require a different approach to that envisaged at the outset, and that joint venture members must be open to discussing that. You'll often hear lawyers talking about the risk will lie where it falls. I have no doubt in my mind that that is an inappropriate approach for the novel consequences presented by COVID-19. And I foresee that in many instances, the best solutions may actually involve renegotiating the underlying joint venture agreement. Obviously, the initial relationship would have been structured with a particular reference framework, geographical, sector, market, legislative, jurisdictional, whatever it would be. It would have taken into account the resource and capital contributions of each party, and generally on the basis that they will be able to perform their scope of work. It also would have taken into account jurisdictional issues, constraints, obligations related to the country of the site, the country of the supply chain, the country of the members. Each of the circumstances here is likely to have changed now. COVID-19 impacts may be social or human resource related and or supply chain and logistics related. The relevant events are likely to be a mix of force majeure in the broad sense and change in law and or governmental action related to various issues across multiple jurisdictions. 2 examples. Consider, for example, that a supplier may have had the possibility 8 weeks ago to reschedule its production facility or perhaps even procure supplies from a different factory fabrication facility. That may have changed completely now, where there's now a legislative impediment preventing that supplier from operating at all, as we've seen in various lockdowns across the world. Another example might be that the very legislation, antitrust and competition legislation that prevented parties from engaging openly at the outset may now have changed, and that very legislation may actually require the parties to share information and cooperate with a view to overcoming the circumstances of the pandemic. Joint venture members will need to carefully consider a wide array of matters against what is an unpredictable and continually developing circumstance, including whether the current leadership and governance processes are appropriate, whether they are the most suitable to navigate the joint venture through the coming weeks and months, potential insolvency or financial constraints of other members and the impact on the JV, the likelihood of the potential consequences of recovery from or by contracting counterparties being limited, termination being a possibility, antitrust and competition issues, and obviously dispute resolution requirements as well. Now, employers at this point in time will clearly be scouring their contracts to understand what rights they have against joint venture contractors. Although the FIDIC contracts themselves, and I speak here broadly, white, red, yellow, emerald, silver, gold, may only have limited express obligations related to contractor joint ventures. What joint venture members need to appreciate is that each of them are jointly and severally liable for the obligations, unless the contract's been substantially changed. But ultimately, every obligation now becomes yours, even if it wasn't to be performed by you in the first place. So each joint venture member must therefore be reviewing their contracts with the understanding of the extent to which it is responsible for all the obligations, whether contractor consultant, with a view to fully appreciating the risk it faces if its joint venture partner or partners are unable or perhaps no longer even around to perform the obligations. and must do that transparently and openly. This brings me back to the initial issue about needing to engage transparently and how we need a different approach with COVID-19. The risk associated with non-performing partners is now no longer a risk, it's an issue, and it will remain an issue vis-a-vis the employer and third parties, notwithstanding what the underlying joint venture agreement might provide at this point. You see, that those carefully crafted JV inter-party obligations and indemnities may themselves be subject to force majeure protection and may be relatively toothless in the event of an insolvency of the JV counterparty. The better and sooner one understands the true scenario and impact, the sooner a well-considered and appropriate mitigation strategy can be adopted. I want to close, Nelson, by referring to a quote which is in our guide by Sean Flanagan, who's Group Executive of Avenge, which resonates with me now even more than February. Simply this: successful JVs are a function of real contribution to the outcome of the project from all partners, not just risk sharing.
Thank you very much, Rob, for that very insightful way of looking at it. I think the first point that I'll pick up there, you're saying the legal perspective is not different from what Tony outlined. And I'm glad you raised the issue. I think the point that I hear loud and clear without you saying that is, in a joint venture, we are all joint and several liable. So we need to work way through the process and make sure we find the right solution. The issues we take on board at the early stage may not be actually relevant now, and different decisions need to be taken. Transparency is honesty. At this point, I am going to invite President and CEO of CDM Smith, Anthony Bouchard, to give us his own perspective, which is looking at it from practitioner point of view, who are involved with projects all over the world. And it will be interesting to see whether Tony Bouchard also shared the same view, all based from different angles. Tony, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this panel, Nelson and Bill, and I thank the FIDIC organization, and thank you all for joining today. First and foremost, I hope everyone and their families are well and safe. I'd like to take an opportunity to frame my conversation around the CDM Smith business. We have our normal consulting business, which represents about 75% of our work, and we have our construction business, which encompasses about 25% of our work. We operate globally. About 70% of our work is in 75% of our work is in North America, and the remaining percentage is internationally, of which a big chunk of that is following the U.S. government around the world. We typically do not use the FIDIC model in our North America joint ventures. We do use it in our Europe business and in some other international locations. Our engineering joint ventures are typically what we call responsibility joint ventures. This means that the joint venture members, each party carries the upside and the downside for the performance of its work, but of course, each party is still jointly and severally liable to the owner for the entire project. That is why we have a strong due diligence process to determine which companies we're going to team with to ensure they have the resources, the finances, and insurance to meet their obligations under that agreement, which is particularly important in the COVID-19 environment today. Our construction and design build joint venture agreements have evolved over time, and we have used three general types of joint ventures for our construction work. What we call an all-in JV that I just talked about, where all costs are shared based on the percentage of the joint venture agreement terms. The responsibility joint venture, where each member's responsibilities are clearly delineated. And then we've also come up with a hybrid, where certain portions of the work are on an all-in basis and certain portions are of the responsibility type. Clearly, there's no perfect model, and each has its pros and cons. I was thrilled to listen to both Tony and Rob to get their perspectives and hopefully my comments on how we're seeing the COVID-19 environment affecting our joint ventures aligns with what they have said. Most of our joint ventures are in our construction unit and in our U.S. federal government unit. The impact from COVID-19 are primarily driven by the language in the agreement between the client and the joint venture. We have spent the first few weeks in this environment notifying our clients of our force majeure language and any change in law provisions, and of the potential time and financial impact to the project. The biggest issue we will face and others will face in this environment is demonstrating causation. We will need to show clearly how COVID-19 has impacted our projects, both from a time and a cost impact. On our largest project, we have, and it's a $2 billion project, we have two noticeable impacts. One is pertaining to the supply chain, where key components had to ship from China to meet the schedule, and they were delayed in shipping due to the coronavirus, as you can imagine. The second is a decline in attendance of the total craft by approximately 25% after the risks from the coronavirus were publicized and made public. So that absenteeism is causing issues in terms of delivery and meeting our delivery schedule. The language in the agreement is key to determining if there is relief, either schedule relief or cost relief. Decision-making and capitalization has not been an issue so far for us. The impact will be driven by our client's ability to keep paying the joint ventures that we're in. The other area is accountability from the managing partner of the joint venture. They need to continue to submit timely invoices and to keep the other partners informed of the timing and amounts of the receipts from the client, so each affiliate can understand the impact on the cash flow of their individual entity. We've been assessing all our joint ventures during this time, and one of our biggest concerns is slow payment when we are not the managing partner in charge of the client invoicing and payment receipts. We continually track our contractual obligations for prompt payments and will very quickly jump on these when we observe them sliding. But if we're not in the managing partner role, we can fly a bit blind in that not always in a scenario like we find ourselves in today, the priorities of the individual affiliates may not match exactly the priorities of the joint venture. For the engineering and construction community, for the most part, decision-making is continuing in an uninterrupted manner. For our clients, there have been delays in authorizations that require board or city council or federal government votes. Whether there will be major delays in decision on capital contributions will not be apparent for another 1 or 2 months from our viewpoint. For our construction joint ventures, a responsibility joint venture tends to stimulate the two joint venture partners having an overly parochial perspective on performance versus a single integrated focus on project execution. This is why we developed a hybrid approach, which attempts to keep enough work at the JV level so there is a portion of the work that is all in, and the performance work each JV partner performs is on a responsibility basis, with each partner taking the performance risk. Regarding the things that we're focused on during this coronavirus environment, first and foremost, a focus on the safety of our stakeholders. Our employees, our joint venture partners' employees, and our client employees, as well as all subconsultants on our large construction projects around the world. We need to make sure we understand our JV partners' cash positions. We need to verify that major subs and suppliers are getting paid by the joint venture partner, particularly if you're not in the managing partner role. We need to track payments by the owner to make sure that the managing partner is distributing cash to the partners promptly, and obtain verification that capital funds remain to execute the projects by our clients. And finally, the importance of quality communications with all stakeholders and seeking win-win solutions is very important. You heard both Rob and Tony talk about the ability to identify risk collaboratively at the joint venture level and then seek to have those open communications with our clients. Thank you very much, Nelson.
Thank you very much, Anthony Bouchard, and thanks very much for, again, looking at it from a pragmatic point of view. It's interesting, the sort of the distribution of your business, 75% consulting and 25% contracting, and a lot of the contracting are very much, global. My take on that is I hear the same word coming through: proper due diligence in your partnership, open conversation. The issue about slow payment was quite an issue. And I also hear the safety of stakeholders and open conversation are the key to unlock this issue. I do take that on board very carefully. And I just wonder at this point if I probably bring Jafar in again from another consulting practice who will probably have a blend, but maybe in geographical diversification, looking at it from that point. Jafar, would you sort of give me your 5-10 minutes, perspective on this? Thank you.
Sure. So we at Mott, our experience is probably not too dissimilar to that of CDM Smith, except that we're an engineering organisation and we don't really do construction. But what I would say is that I really do share the experiences that we have are really consistent with the speakers that have gone before me. In that the answer isn't just in the contract. So I'll come back to that in just a second. Coming back to actually setting the framework, how are joint ventures, how are they important to Mott Macdonald? Why do we enter into those joint ventures? And then I'll go on to how COVID-19 has impacted on us. So similar to CDM Smith, we enter into joint venture agreements for a number of key reasons. One is, for example, there's areas of expertise that we don't have. So we'll create a joint venture with another engineering or consulting firm that actually brings in that expertise for us to be able to win projects. Another one that probably hasn't been spoken about is it might be in particular jurisdictions, or the client may require an international consultant to be involved in a project. So for example, we have an entity in Pakistan. We also have partners, or we have affiliates in KSA who are looking for us to input into their project or input into their bid to be able to provide our expertise on the project. We might not have people on the ground, but they do. So we'll enter into a joint venture agreement in those particular circumstances. Coming back to what CDM Smith was saying, and then the question is whether you're providing an integrated service or whether you're providing a several service, whereby we can particularly identify the services that we provide and particularly identify the services that the joint venture partner provides. And why is that important? Well, then that goes into the joint venture agreement. If you have a look at the FIDIC agreement and the way that the indemnity is working there, it's got a cross indemnity. So the question is whether, if you can separately identify the services, the first port of call can obviously then be you flow down the risk based on the services performed, as opposed to having a complicated cross indemnity arrangement. All this is obviously very important in terms of when you're formulating the joint venture agreement, trying to work out and trying to anticipate what we have today is events that will occur that then impact on the joint venture parties. So typically what parties and everyone on this call would have gone through is the typical scenarios or the what ifs of what if the client issues us with a variation? What if the project is delayed? What if there's extra inputs that need to happen? What if you don't get the approvals that you need? It's the common scenarios, and then therefore you work out between the joint venture partner and yourself at the outset in the joint venture agreement how those risks will play out. The problem with the COVID-19 event that we have experienced, and as the speakers before me have said, is that this is all novel. It's uncharted waters for everybody. And at the time when you enter into the joint venture agreement, you think, well, for example, if there was a meteor event which stopped work for a month or two, if you cover your demobilisation costs and if you cover your remobilisation costs and some of the other costs, it'll be fine. No one's actually sat down and looked at, well, what if there's a meteoric event which affects the entire globe, which affects the entire business? You only need to look at Qantas. You only need to look at some of the other large organisations around the world, which are multi-billion-dollar organisations, and they will tell you the same thing that we are saying and the other consultants are saying, that if there's a drop-off in work, these companies, which are blue-chip companies, which are meant to have large cash reserves, will soon become insolvent. When project sites are stopping and suddenly, therefore, your payment stream dries up because the risk lies where it falls. And so therefore, we're supposed to A, keep paying our staff, but also we're supposed to deal with standby costs. How do you fund staff payments when that's your core asset? How do you fund that for months and months and months when your revenue stream might reduce by 20, 30, 50, 60%? Suddenly you're looking at a scenario where the traditional mechanism, which is taken up by FIDIC and all other standard form contracts of the risk lies where it falls, doesn't quite work. And so therefore I absolutely concur with the speakers before me, which is that the solution cannot be, in this instance, the risk lies where it falls. That just can't work. And so in the scenarios that we are dealing with, so we've got a couple of live disputes whereby the client has put a stop to our work. We've sat down with our joint venture partner and we've tried to work out the best way forward. Again, the joint venture has always traditionally been the joint venture working together behind the scenes and then presenting a common face to the client. Suddenly though, with COVID-19, that is becoming problematic. And we have a couple of live examples whereby we actually don't want to trigger the force majeure clause. Our joint venture partner does. And that's because we've got a completely different view in terms of whether COVID-19 is a force majeure event or whether we should try to continue doing work. And so therefore, in such instance, rather than looking at the contract, rather than the lawyers taking a view, what we've done is we've gone to the client and said, look, if you don't help us out, if we have to rely on the force majeure clause, or if you put a stop to this project, you're going to have two insolvent joint venture partners. It's not in the client's interest when we're already 50 to 80% through the project to not have the conversation with us, so that the pain is shared because it's a mutual benefit for all parties concerned, not just looking at the joint venture partners, but also the client. They may have to invest a little bit more in the project to make sure that there's a cash flow that goes through to the consultant. But that, in effect, will be a win-win for all the parties concerned. So it's not about what's just in the joint venture agreement. It's not just about what's in the consultancy agreement, but it's what is best for all the parties concerned. And I would implore the people on this call to have the strength to go and speak to their client on a commercial basis and sit down and see if they can hammer out a deal. The other thing that can be done is looking at the business as a whole and looking at, as one of the speakers mentioned, what can you do with the supply chain? maybe you can push some of the payment streams back through the whole supply chain, because surely it's better to be paid in 90 days than 30 days, by which time, if you elongate all the payment stream all the way down the supply chain, hopefully we will be out of this event in about 60 or 90 days. So therefore giving everyone the breathing room that they need, while also ensuring that, you know what, it's better to be paid than not being paid at all. Thanks, Nelson.
Thank you very much, Jafar, for that insightful case study that you picked up, which is quite interesting. And I know that, you know, I'm sure that if you go around other speakers, they will have a little case study to look at. I particularly like the way you raised the issue about perhaps going to the client and be honest with the client, and position all the stuff on the client and find a mutually beneficial solution for all parties, especially when your JV partner choose not to play ball or decided to play a different game, which goes back to what Tony Barry said, that, you know, the agenda, you know, the philosophy that everybody had at the beginning of JV may no longer be in alignment, and things may move on because circumstances of your business may be different from others. So I'm going to really try and close out and bring Husni into it. And Husni will be looking at it from the FIDIC perspective and give us his own view on the same subject. And thereafter, I'm going to open up a question and answer session. So Husni, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nelson. In my culture, we say Assalamu alaikum, which means may peace be upon you all. So I wish you and your families peace, good health, and safety from this nasty virus. And I hope someday we will meet on this forum, maybe a webinar, lessons learned from the ordeal that we have passed. Speaking of JVs and consortiums, of course, we shouldn't forget about that terminology. FIDIC has served to this end nearly 30 years ago, when the first edition of the subconsultancy agreement was published by FIDIC back in 1992. Now we have the model joint venture between brackets consortium agreement between consultants 2017 second edition. So we have provided to the industry several forms of agreements during the past 30 years. And yes, they only serve for joint ventures and consortiums, and I come to this shortly, between consultants, but we have observed in the industry, even JVs and consortiums among contractors, they are borrowing many principles outlined in these forms of agreement. Sorry, because they are addressing so many crucial points in between JV and consortium members. Now, JV or consortium, that is the question. Now, unfortunately, there's no internationally recognized definition of what a JV is and a consortium is. These two terms are used interchangeably in the industry. In many scenarios, we have a JV arrangement vis-a-vis the employer, but in between the partners, they have actually what we can call a consortium arrangement. This depends on the risk allocation and the strength of the members and so on and so forth, the requirements of the agreement between the consultant and the client, or even if we extend it to the employer and the contractor, if they take many of the principles we have in our agreements. So this is why the 2017 edition, to clarify this issue, it says joint venture between brackets consortium, and our model agreement only serves to the needs of unincorporated JVs. So we're talking here about unincorporated JVs. Now, the all members are jointly and severally liable towards the client. In brief, the structure of this form of agreement, we have a steering committee. It's the forum for the high-ranking officers of the participants in the JV or consortium. Now, also we have what is called the leading member. Usually the leading member is the member with the highest shares among the partners. And there's an obligation upon the leading member to nominate the project director, And the project director serves as the chairman for the steering committee. Now, what is the role of the steering committee? Is to decide on policies, on major decisions, most importantly, financial decisions, and the important policies and directions that we need to take in fulfilling our obligations under our agreement with the client. The voting among the members, unless otherwise agreed, of course, is by majority. However, there are certain decisions, they are listed under the agreement, which require unanimous requires a unanimous decision, such as changing the name of the JV and some financial arrangements that need to be changed. But otherwise, the decisions are taken by majority. Our form of agreement does not foresee a casting vote, but members can also agree on a casting vote if no agreement was reached. For example, we have a 50-50 split, maybe the chairman, which is representing the leading member, will have a casting vote, but we don't have this in our agreement. This needs to be included in the particular conditions. Now, who gets his hands dirty doing the work? It's the project manager. We have to differentiate between the project director and the project manager. Now, also the default option in our agreement, it is also the leading member who must nominate the project manager, not the project director, of course, unless otherwise agreed. I've seen some arrangements where the leading member will provide the project director and the second highest shareholder will provide the project manager. So we have the steering committee, a forum for all of the high-ranking officers of the members. We have the leading member, usually holding the highest shares or holding the highest risk among the members. The leading member will have to nominate the project director, who's the chairman or the chair of or chairwoman of the steering committee taking major and important decisions. And the leading member will have also to nominate the project manager who will implement these policies and of course will implement the obligations of the JV and consortium. Now we have several mechanisms in our agreements to deal with the mode of operation, to deal with the situation where we have a defaulting member among the consortium or JV. We have also clauses to deal with disputes, cross indemnities and responsibilities in between the partners. Now, all of my colleagues have tabled so many problems. Now, I guess the most difficult problem when it comes to JVs and consortiums is not the relationship with the client, and this is a challenge by itself, but how can we distribute the liabilities and the challenges in between us. So for example, we have one of the members was cornered into a situation where that member needs to declare bankruptcy and insolvency. How can we deal with this? And the other members are unable to buy out because these days we have difficult cash flow situations and financing burdens, or a certain member is unable to pump in the required cash as per the agreement, and the others are unable to cover for that member. These, I guess, are challenging situations that need to be discovered because the agreement between the client and the consultant has its own mechanisms, but these internal mechanisms and challenges need to be more explored so that we can arrive at solutions which we always promote to be win-win solutions. Zero-sum solutions will get us nowhere in this COVID-19 situation. Don't forget that this is the first time we encountered this situation in nearly a century. So nearly, I'm sure all or most of the agreements, contracts, and so on and so forth, they do not provide clear-cut solutions and mechanisms on how to deal with COVID-19, bearing in mind the different jurisdictions and the legal systems and so on, so forth. Thank you so much, Nelson. I think this is it for me for now.
Husni, thank you very much for giving us a very good, vivid view of the JV agreement under FIDIC. I think, you know, if I were to sum that up, you give us the structure, the governance, who takes a leading role and who has responsibility. Key point you raised that these are principally to do with unincorporated joint venture. And you raised the issue that joint and several liability is a big issue that comes into that. the bit that you actually allude to, which is the point I really want to pick up, is the issue about, if you have a partner who is insolvent and the other partner is unable to pick it up, how do you deal with that? So the question I'm just going to, before I start my questioning to each and every one of you, I'm going to go to the audience and actually say, this is your time to pose questions to the panel. The question can be to the individual or to a collective panel, and I'll do my best to try and pick them up as we go through. But whilst you're getting ready to put your question forward, and the opportunity is there for you to raise the question I'm raising, is I'm going to start one or two questions. I think, Husni, you just finished, and you raised the issue about where one party failed to be able to bail out the other party. What are the mechanics that's available, that one can take in resolving that, where you've got to find that, of course, COVID-19 and the mechanism may force more insolvency, and one party may fail. I hear you, and I also hear the same thing coming up from Jafar earlier on to say we have a difficult JV partner who doesn't want to play ball. It could be difficult because their own financial position is not what it used to be. They can't get the parent guarantee. They can't deal with all those issues. So in your mind, how do you think one can actually address that issue? In other words, you have in a JV, it's an unincorporated one, there's a potential insolvency. Are there mechanics in the process that allows us to deal with that or not?
Yes, in the agreement, we have several mechanisms to deal with this. The mechanism of the defaulting member. Now, the agreement expressly says that if there is a defaulting member, then the other members will have to take out the scope out of the hands of that defaulting member to the extent if all of that member's obligations are not being fulfilled by that member as a consequence of a default, then the other members will take that scope out of the hands of that member and do it themselves. So we have this mechanism. Also, all of the members are jointly and severally liable towards the employer. So if this member goes into insolvency or whatever, we will have to cover for that member. Now, the real challenge is on how we can cover for that member. Of course, there will be maybe bank guarantees in between the consortium JV members to cover for their share. Maybe we can resort to that. Maybe we can obtain further facilities from our own banks to cover for that defaulting member. And if this escalates into a dispute in between the members, also we have a three-tier mechanism for dispute resolution. First of all, we resort to amicable settlement under subclause 22.1 in our JV form of agreement. If that fails, then we resort to mediation. The general condition says in accordance with the ICC mediation rules, and this is mentioned under subclause 22.2. And in the ultimate, if this dispute does not get finally resolved by these two lines of defense, then the last line of defense is arbitration, and the general conditions state that this arbitration is in accordance with the ICC rules. Of course, you can amend any reference to the ICC to any other entities or rules for mediation or arbitration.
Thanks very much. Tony, Barry, do you have a view on that particular issue? I mean, I know you said this in earlier on, just looking at it globally in terms of the view. What would be your recommendation to come out of the jam? If you have a JV partner who does not want to play ball, circumstances has changed, and you are forced to carry the responsibility, what would be your recommendation?
Well, I think the FIDIC agreement does set out the process fairly clearly, and it might be that for the defaulting partner, it may seem quite brutal in a way, but the reality is the client still wants the job completed, and the other joint venture partner, through the joint and several liability clause, is required to carry on. So in that circumstance, the hard answer is enforce the agreement. Sometimes the hard answer is not always the right answer, and it's not always good for the industry, and it may not be good for the players. And that's why I recommended a number of alternatives be explored before you get to the hard answer. There are many, many options available in terms of loan security or capital, very many in terms of resources. So there are many other solutions before you go to war. And my encouragement is actually the world is in this thing pretty much together. Your turn will come if you haven't already had it, and your turn will come in later life. So it's a better thing in my mind to work through the scenario, find a solution that works and keeps people with their reputation, hopefully, and hopefully keeps them employed.
Thanks very much, Tony. The next question I was going to put across maybe to Anthony Bouchard is really to do with the contractors in place. The question goes, if a contractor under the FIDIC contract or whatever contract is being used, my understanding is when you are working outside North America, you work under the FIDIC joint venture. What does the COVID-19 impact on joint venture mean for a project? In other words, if a contractor under the FIDIC works on the contract, constitutes a joint venture, and the COVID impact, joint venture means for a project, what is the overall implication for you, Anthony Bouchard, in your experience working overseas?
Yes. Well, thank you. Let me try to clarify. We distinguish on the construction side where we will do work overseas. Our only construction work overseas is for the U.S. government, primarily for USAID or the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So we would not be utilizing the FIDIC joint venture agreement working for either of those two entities of the U.S. Federal government. Our other work at the moment overseas is on our consulting side of our business and primarily in Europe. So I want to clarify, Nelson, if the question's on the construction side or the consulting side.
Well, I mean, if you have this view on the consulting side, that would be helpful, Anthony. Thank you.
Well, I think it's consistent with what we've heard. We frankly do not have a lot of joint ventures overseas. We do have some in Europe, and at the moment they are going well. The same normal things that we have to consider hopefully was done in our early due diligence with respect to the strength and viability of our partners, that they can continue. But in the COVID-19 environment, things are substantially different. In other words, depending on our partners' portfolio, where they work, could have a significant impact on their cash flow, given the markets they're in and the geographies they're in, and the same can be said of us from their point of view. But at the moment, most of our work is considered essential because it's usually in the water supply or water pollution control or environmental services that are continuing. We're taking some of the best practices that were talked about here today, mitigation conversations with our joint venture partners, transparency with respect to the managing partners invoicing and billing and when cash receipts are saved. And of course, as several folks have mentioned today, highly elevated focus on safety of our employees, our joint venture partners' employees, clients' employees, and all sub-consultant employees working together.
Thanks very much, Anthony. The next question, really, I'm going to put it to Rob. And the question goes along the line, what if the responsibility of one party is materially impacted by COVID-19, but not the responsibility of the other parties? In another word, what are the remedies available to such suffering party? Rob?
Almost didn't take myself off mute, Nelson. So I think the first thing to consider is whether those obligations can be performed only by that party. Let's perhaps consider a joint venture where the joint venture is between a consultant that has the technical ability, perhaps the IP solution, to deliver a particular concept, a particular technology, and the other partner is the construction or balance of plant partner, perhaps, or designing the balance of plant. If both parties have the equal capacity to deliver, joint and several liability is the great leveler. In other words, one party will simply have to take over. And of course, as Husni said, there's methods in the joint venture agreement to determine how that will be ultimately played out, but we don't have the time in this case to go through all those dispute resolution processes while the obligation has to be performed. So if the obligation can continue, then the joint venture having joint and several responsibility is likely not incapable of performing it. On the other hand, if, for example, the technology partner is the one impacted and you cannot do anything without that technology, that may impact the delivery. So ultimately it depends what the obligation is, whether the parties can take over the performance of the obligation or not. And that'll also determine whether or not the actual impact is a force majeure event or not in those circumstances. So ultimately, the obligation has to be performed if it's jointly and severally liable. That's the great leveler. Whether or not it may be suspended as a result of, and I see some questions on the group as well around whether or not COVID-19 is a force majeure event. That's a topic for a full hour in itself, a full day, in fact. But assuming that the joint venture can still perform, it likely won't be because of the joint and several liability. The disputes can later be dealt with. In other words, what the impact of that is. Has there been additional cost incurred? But that'll probably be between the joint venture parties internally, not something that's passed on to the client or other third party.
Thanks very much. Jafar, in your presentation earlier on, you talked about why you go into different jurisdictions and partner with different people, whether it's a straight, one-on-one, or whether you do a hybrid whereby they bring complementary to the situation. Have you had the experience where you may have a situation where you're unable because you don't have the skill set? How do you overcome that issue where your partner is being frustrated, you don't have the capability? How would you want to come out of that particular situation? Jafar?
So in terms of if the joint venture partner is being frustrating or where we might not have the capability, I think it comes back to what Anthony was saying right at the very start, which is that it's in both parties' best interest to make sure that we deliver to the client, and so I think that's a linchpin there. And the second protection is the fact that both parties are jointly and severally liable. So neither party wants to take on the other party's risk or wants to be in a position where they have to pick up liability. So what we're doing, for example, if there's a dispute, I think the key is to get to the bottom of why that dispute is occurring in the first instance. So, for example, the dispute that I was talking about, it was simply because the parties had very different ideas as to how force majeure was going to work, how it was going to be treated, what the client would ultimately want to pay for. So rather than so I think a lot has been spoken about on this call about the processes and the protections in the FIDIC contract. And I absolutely agree. It's really well drafted. It's absolutely watertight. But for the most part, you need to remember, if you're in a live project and you need to resolve it within, say, 24 or 48 hours, then you're not going to go to arbitration. So the way that we're resolving disputes when the other party doesn't agree, as opposed to not being able to perform, is in this instance, we're going to an expert third party, and we're simply presenting our case to both parties, to the expert, and we both agree to be bound by whatever the expert says. So I think to answer your question, I kind of went through a lot of detail there, but to answer your question, it really comes down to another view issue as to why you've got the dispute or one party's failing to perform in the first instance. And once you crack that, and you're on the same page, because that's what the JV is all about. It's being on the same page. Once you're on the same page, back on the same page, that's when the JV will work.
Thanks very much. Now I've got a question coming from the floor. There's questions specific directed to Husni and to Tony and also to Rob. But actually, I'll pick up the generic question, which I probably need to get your views on this. And the question actually goes across is does the panel think that the shape of the inevitable global contraction in business will be a steep V shape or a U shape? In other words, we've now gone into major meltdown. Is this something that we think we're going to come out of it very quickly? If you remember what we went through in 2009, there was a V shape, or was a U shape, or a W shape. So what is the view of the panel? I'm picking up generic one. Tony, let's start from yours.
Yeah, I happen to be a director of a wealth management company, which has about 7.5 billion Australian dollars under management. That's my hobby. But I offer this comment not as an expert, but as a share trader, a very active one right at the moment. My view is it's a U shape. My view is we're probably going to come back and recover probably something like 10 to 15% of the 35% lost, and then we're going to have a very slow climb out. And that slow climb out and the rate of that is going to depend on a couple of things. And leadership from government is going to be one of them. And some of us realise that in some parts of the world that's sadly lacking still. The second thing is whether or not there's a vaccine that turns up quickly. Or not, and I don't think the answer is that's going to be quick. And then I think the third thing, which is I think going to play out, is whether countries, and this is going to take a combined effort from government and from industry, to work out how we get back to work. And some countries are already focused on this, and of course the medical side of, they need to be very cautious about going back too quickly, understand all that, but we have to work out a strategy to get back. And that's going to take a lot of careful thought, and it's a pretty complicated thing. So yeah, I'm going for the U shape.
Okay. Can I ask Anthony Bouchard, what's your take? Is it a V or a U or W? Which one is yours, Anthony Bouchard? Is Anthony still with us? We missed you. Okay, while waiting, can I go to Rob then?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay, sorry, Anthony. Yeah, come back online. The question goes.
My apologies.
The question goes is, do you foresee that the contraction in the industry will end up with a sort of a U shape or a V shape? And my third question, would it be a W? You know, I hate to say that. Which one is your take?
Well, I'm certainly not an expert on global economics, but it is the million-dollar question. I would like to think it's more in the range of a U shape. I think that what the takeaway from all this is, it's going to depend on a lot of factors, as most of those were just mentioned. That I don't think we know. And I think the prudent thing to do, and the prudent thing that my organization is doing, is being prepared for any eventuality to ensure our organization is resilient. We're looking at all impacts of our business, certainly a cash flow impact, what the impact is from our move towards globally working from home, whether that will be as efficient and effective as we think it is. We made significant investments over the last 3 years that are paying off in our ability to do that from a technology standpoint. And we've created various modeling tools using data analytics to understand on a very rapid pace what the data is telling us on what we need to do and what levers we need to pull in order to remain resilient through this, whatever shape the curve takes. But my hope is we make that recovery, a big portion of it, soon after we get out of the Corona-19 environment, hopefully. Certainly with the hope and prayers that we don't see dramatic continued increases in deaths and illnesses, and then a steady climb back to previous conditions.
Thank you very much, Anthony. I was going to avoid going back into issue of force majeure because we covered this extensively last week, Thursday. But the question keep coming back, and I just thought I'm going to divert from that by going back to one. And this is really put across maybe to Rob and say, how does the force majeure clause come to a party into this situation? How does this affect the JV partner in terms of COVID-19? I mean, is there, Rob, this is question really directed to you. You know, where exactly do you place the, COVID-19, the force majeure on a joint venture? This is a question straight to you. I can't hear you. Can you unmute?
I was on mute from head office, from Geneva. Nelson, by the way, you gave me extra time on the other question, and I had drawn a U, but then as the eternal optimist, I put a smiley face inside it, and that's what the lawyer thinks of this. So it's I doubt it's going to be a U shape, by the way. FIDIC's force majeure clause, and I've seen some questions come up as well. People seem to go straight from clause 19.1, ignore A, B, C, and D, and move straight into 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And they say, well, it doesn't fit into it. It's not a war hostility. It's not a rebellion. It's not a riot. That's not the essence of the FIDIC clause. FIDIC has what we call an open category force majeure clause. In other words, it defines force majeure very broadly. It defines us as an exceptional event. The 2017 edition takes out the reference to exceptional. So once the event qualifies under the 4 legs, A, B, C, and D, you don't have to worry about whether it's exception anymore, but most contracts now are still going to be under the 1999 form. So it has to satisfy 2 legs, exceptional, and then it has to be beyond a party's control that the party could not reasonably have provided for before entering the contract. Once arisen, you cannot reasonably overcome or avoid, and then not substantially attributable to the other party. That 4th leg is simply this: it cannot be a breach. In other words, if it's a breach of contract, it's not a force majeure event from the other party. The truth is that depending on where you are and the events, what you are facing now as an engineering construction community across the world will probably be a change in law, will be a force majeure event. It could fit into many categories. As far as a joint venture goes, whether or not it is a force majeure event will depend on the definition itself. In other words, if an event arises which prevents the performance of the obligations, as I said before, if joint venture partner A can continue and joint venture partner B cannot, it may not be a force majeure event. Simple example. You have the capacity to do a design in 2 jurisdictions. The one jurisdiction is under lockdown, the other jurisdiction is not affected at all by COVID-19. Are you prevented? It may be different if the activities on site are prevented or taken into account. So the first thing is, where does it sit? Well, as I said earlier on, a joint venture may feel the impact of COVID-19 exponentially because the parties may not be prevented, both of them. But assuming they are, as a general view, what we're seeing is either 8.4, 8.4 governmental action or impacts by pandemic, changes in law, or FM events. There's no reason why it shouldn't apply and doesn't apply to joint ventures like individual contractors, except where a party to a joint venture can continue performing. Remember, the obligation vis-a-vis the client is joint and several. The obligation internally to the joint venture may be a different one, but you need to look at what's joint and several. Hope I've answered that.
Thank you very much. Question from the floor. It goes on to say, if all members of the JV or consortium go insolvent, but would like to continue the construction work or the project, what steps can be taken on? In other words, both parties to the joint venture come bust, but they would like to be involved in continuation of that project. Now, the question didn't actually say they went bust because they decided to design themselves going bust, but the reality is they just happened to go bust. And you couldn't actually then talk about joint and several liability because nobody is in operation to do that. What are the options to keep the project going? Question, who feel like taking that out? Husni?
Well, if the whole of the joint venture goes bankrupt, there's no way that that joint venture will contribute anyway to the completion of the project. So the clients or the employer's only solution that would be to secure whatever remedies you can under the law, of course, from that joint venture who declared insolvency, and look for somebody else to do the work. Of course, naturally, you will have some performance securities or bank guarantees in your hands as an employer, which I'm certain you will need to liquidate or levy so that you cover some of your losses, of course, in accordance with the contract mechanisms of the contract and the law. But the employers and clients will have to understand that in the case of insolvency, you might not get a penny out of that consortium or JV besides what you can under the performance security or any bank guarantee that you have in your hand. Other than appointing somebody else and what I have just said, I think there's little to be done on the part of the employer or the client.
Okay. Jafar, do you share the same view?
I was going to say, I was going to concur that if one's insolvent, and this is a little bit more detail, A, you're not going to be able to pay your employees, so no one can carry out the work. B, there's going to the actual indemnities that the client would want to enforce would be unenforceable, so therefore the client would want to terminate. Thirdly, your insurance policies would probably fall away, so all the protections that the client would have would also fall away. So A, it would be largely impossible, and B, I can't see why the client would actually want an insolvent party to be performing the works for the services.
Thanks very much, Tony. I think Tony Barry, I think you hands
just
up.
One comment, Nelson, which has occurred or did occur back in '92 when we had that rather awful problem of a recession where companies went bust. I know one client who established a special purpose vehicle, took over all the employees that were involved from the consultant and contractors side and finished the job with their own special purpose vehicle. And I think that allowed people obviously to be employed, allowed the client to complete the project, and the client, of course, got whatever they could. They took possession of every piece of hardware on the site and everything else they could get their hands on to complete the works. But the client obviously has that option, and it's in this kind of environment, I think you're going to see a little bit of that.
Okay. The question from the floor is also, I've got one more question before I wrap up, is that as a result of this COVID-19 and joint venture not actually functioning, does the panel feel that there will be an increase in ad hoc, ADR to resolve problem, or is it going to be business as usual? Husni, do you feel?
Let me understand the question. That ad hoc alternative dispute resolution will, of course, I anticipate so many disputes down the road. Now, of course, we promote win-win situation, collaborative and cooperative solutions, but of course, not all human beings are the same and not all of them are convinced. And don't forget, everybody's losing clients, consultants, employers, contractors. So somebody maybe in your eyes might not be taking action responsibly or sensibly, but maybe that party is being pushed by his or her own losses. So when we lose, we tend to act irrationally, unfortunately. This is human nature. But to be honest with you, this is why I anticipate so many disputes down the road, unfortunately.
Okay. Rob, do you have the same view? Rob, we can't hear you. You have to unmute, Rob.
I am now. We're being the muting is controlled by head office, not by me, unfortunately, at this stage.
I'm sorry about that.
I wasn't saying it was you, Nelson. There's no doubt in my mind that we'll see an increase in disputes. I would hope that we look at it towards an ADR arrangement and more adjudication than anything else, because what we need is those disputes to be resolved as efficiently, effectively, and without significant cost to the parties, and quickly. And I think adjudication would lend itself to that, as would ADR, as methods other than that. So yes, I do believe we'll see an increase. And if the question is, will we see that more adjudication alternative? I would hope so.
Okay. Now, Tony Barry, please.
I don't know whether there'll be more or less, but what I do know is there's a lot of parties out there that will be very substantially wounded by this event. And the likelihood that they're going to be able to pay up or even support large legal teams through big disputes, I think, is unrealistic. I think people will settle because they have to settle.
Okay. Well, on this point, we've got just about 4 minutes to go, and I'm just going to ask each and every one of you for a 1 minute to respond to my question. And I'm going to start in sort of Husni, and then go to Jafar, and go with actually Rob, and then we go Anthony Bouchard, and then finish up with Anthony Barry. We've got a program of webinar of things that we believe the industry is very keen about. What would be your advice to FIDIC as to the topic we should be covering? Started off by Husni.
Thank you, Nelson. I guess the webinars you have cover quite a good array of subjects, but I would maybe suggest some webinar on mediation and negotiation skills and how to achieve win-win situations between the parties, because as I said, and my colleagues said, everybody is injured, everybody is suffering from loss. It's not a clear-cut situation. Contractual and legal solutions in many situations will be zero-sum solutions. So we need to sit down together and discuss and put ourselves in the shoes of the people across the table in front of us. So I would maybe recommend some negotiation skills and mediation webinars. And thank you, Nelson.
Thank you very much. I could go, Jafar, exactly what would be your advice to FIDIC?
So I actually think this is a good chance just to compare how events such as this are dealt with in each of the forms of FIDIC contract, because each one is slightly different. So the wording is slightly different, the relief you get is slightly different, the process is slightly different. So I think from a user's point of view, it'd be good to have the side-by-side comparison. Thank
you very much. Rob?
Nelson, not too different to Husni, actually. I've seen quite a few comments on the chat as we're going along around why FIDIC may not be a collaborative form, and you know how I feel about this. Collaboration isn't a contractually enforced mechanism. Collaboration is a choice. And this idea that you cannot collaborate is something that escapes me. So perhaps there might be room for a webinar on why FIDIC actually does lend itself to a collaborative environment and talking about it, and largely based on the fact that there's ultimately a default position. No one's at risk forever. There's a point at which the weight of the default position is going to be a lose-lose situation for everyone. That encourages engagement. So perhaps something along those lines.
Thanks very much, Rob. Anthony Bouchard, your view, please. What would be your advice to FIDIC going forward on what we should be covering? Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with my fellow panel members on the additional topics with respect to FIDIC contracts. If I could be a little bit more broadly, speak a little bit more broadly for a moment, I would suggest a FIDIC webinar that's focused on what people are seeing in the future. It kind of goes back to the question of a U, a V, or a W-shaped recovery, and trying to understand collectively how our respective clients are approaching the future. Slowdown, status quo, or perhaps a speed up given federal government stimulus packages to drive employment back to previous levels through shovel-ready type projects and so forth. So I think that broader focus to what the future might hold could be valuable.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you. So, Mr. Barry, the floor is yours. You've heard everything so far. I just wonder whether I can leave the floor to you to wrap up on behalf of the board and just give your comment to close out. Tony.
I think Nelson, you should lead a webinar to deliver the solution to this COVID-19 crisis for us all. No, I think in the reality is that we are in a disastrous situation, and we do need to sort out the difficulties. And there's a great, I mean, the webinar program's a very good look at all of those things. But I do think life after COVID-19, or on the way out of COVID-19, and exit strategies from COVID-19 to whatever that new world looks like is a very important group of subjects to be discussing. I think it's important, in talking collaboration, this is an area where we can all share and learn from each other. And to me, it's a really critical question, because I think the industry is not going to look like it did before we went into this. People are also going to have experienced things in this period that they haven't experienced before. They're going to come out as different people. In some respects, they're going to have had different experiences, and some of them will be tougher, some more aggressive, some more optimistic, some more pessimistic, etc. Some wishing to rebalance their lives and work from home more often. There'll be all sorts of changes. So I do think contemplating the changes and life after COVID-19 and how to exit from it are the critical things.
Thank you very much, Tony. I mean, we said we're going to try and finish on time. It's 13:31, which is quite appropriate, 1 minute just over. I just want to start off by saying we started this webinar program by saying we do have a 20 program. We are on the 3rd out of that 20, so we've got 17 to go. It's quite interesting, a number of the topics suggested for us to cover: mediation, negotiation, collaborative issue, looking at the future. What does the future look like? Exit strategy. How does the world change but still move on? These are the things that we've already identified in the subsequent webinars. So I am pleased that we are going in the right direction, and we will take your feedback and make sure that we modify those particular programs to be relevant. I just want to finish on a few notes. First of all, I am delighted that FIDIC is able to host this. And at the peak of this conversation, we had nearly 480 on, which is very good. JV is something that will be here, and in future will continue to be, regardless of what happened on COVID-19. The speakers talked about the rationale for it. Those changes will not going to happen overnight, will continue to be, because people will need JV to deliver in different jurisdictions, different geography, different issues. Sometimes the client will insist on it, and sometimes it's a means of strengthening your capability as an organization. Whether we like it or not, this will happen. COVID-19 is here. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like it's going to be a sprinting job. It sounds like it's going to be a marathon job. And the question whether it's going to be a U or V or W, I don't think any one of us have the answer. The scientists are making a lot of prediction, and we are watching, because we are in the engineering field. My closing comment is really, it's been great to have Bill Howard to support in all this program, and to have, Anthony Barry from Australia supporting us. Also, Anthony Bouchard from States also supporting. I'm really grateful. Rob, from South Africa, Jafar from, Dubai, and Husni from Jordan. So thank you very much for all your time. Thanks for your contribution. For those who are listening, we are delighted you're able to join us. We will do everything possible to make sure a copy of this is available on the link. Our next particular subject is going to be consultancy agreement and the role of engineers within that, COVID-19. That will be discussed on Thursday, which is going to be on the 16th. I will encourage you to try and join us, or signpost it to anybody that you think may be interested. This is across the whole of construction and engineering sector. It's not listed only to consulting firm. So on that note, be safe, keep safe, and God bless. Thank you very much.